The distant rumble of naval bombardments reached us in the early hours of June 6, 1944. It was a sound unlike anything I had heard before, a deep, rhythmic thunder that seemed to shake the earth itself. As a soldier stationed near Omaha Beach, we had been warned of an impending Allied invasion, but no amount of preparation could have prepared us for what we were about to witness. The air was thick with tension, and even the most seasoned among us wore the strain on their faces. We knew something monumental was coming, though none of us fully grasped the scale of it. The first light of dawn revealed a sight that sent a chill down my spine. Out on the horizon, the sea was alive with movement. Dozens, no, hundreds of ships blanketed the water, their silhouettes forming an unbroken line against the morning sky. At first, we thought it was a deception, a bluff to draw our focus while the real attack came elsewhere. But as the minutes passed and the sheer magnitude of the fleet became clear, a sense of dread settled over us. This was no feint. This was the invasion we had feared, and it was far beyond anything we had imagined. Orders came through to prepare for the assault. Our officers barked commands, but there was no disguising the tremor in their voices. We scrambled to our positions, manning the machine guns and loading the artillery. The bunkers we had built and reinforced over the months felt solid, but in that moment, they seemed like flimsy barriers against the storm bearing down on us. The air was heavy with the smell of salt and sweat as we waited, our hearts pounding in unison with the distant explosions. Then the bombardment began. The Allied ships opened fire, their cannons unleashing a relentless barrage that turned the beach into a cauldron of smoke and flame. The noise was deafening, a continuous roar that drowned out everything else. The ground shook violently, and chunks of concrete and earth were thrown into the air as the shells found their marks. Inside the bunkers, we huddled together, clinging to the illusion of safety even as the walls around us trembled. Every explosion felt like it was meant for me, and I could see the same fear in the eyes of my comrades. We had trained for this, but training meant nothing when death was raining down from above. As the bombardment continued, the first wave of landing craft appeared. They moved steadily through the water, their ramps lowered to reveal rows of American soldiers packed tightly together. It was a surreal sight, these tiny vessels braving the inferno we had created on the beach. Our machine guns roared to life, cutting through the early morning haze as we targeted the incoming troops. Men fell before they even touched the sand, their bodies crumpling in the surf. Yet, despite the withering fire, they kept coming. Wave after wave, the Americans pressed forward, their determination unshaken by the carnage. The chaos on the beach was unlike anything I had ever seen. Explosions tore through the air, sending shards of metal and flesh in all directions. The screams of the wounded mingled with the relentless gunfire, creating a cacophony that seemed to go on forever. Our defenses held for a time, but the sheer number of attackers was overwhelming. They advanced with a grim resolve, using the bodies of their fallen comrades as cover. It was both horrifying and awe-inspiring to witness their resilience. They were not just soldiers. They were a force of nature, unstoppable and unyielding. As the battle raged on, I began to notice cracks forming in our defenses. Communications were spotty at best, and the chaos made it nearly impossible to coordinate our efforts. Ammunition was running low, and the constant bombardment from the Allied ships made it clear that help was not coming. Morale was crumbling, and the once confident voices of my comrades were now tinged with despair. We had been told that the Atlantic Wall was impenetrable, that no enemy could breach our defenses. But standing there, watching the Americans gain ground inch by inch, I realized that was a lie. The wall was not impenetrable, and we were not invincible. I remember one moment vividly. A young soldier, barely out of his teens, was manning a machine gun next to me. His hands were trembling so badly he could hardly keep the weapon steady. He looked at me, his eyes wide with fear, and asked, "Do you think we can stop them?" I wanted to reassure him, to tell him that we had a chance, but the words caught in my throat. How could I lie to him when the truth was so painfully obvious? Instead, I said nothing, focusing on firing my own weapon and hoping it would be enough. It wasn't. The Americans continued their relentless advance, their numbers seeming to grow with each passing moment. they reached the first line of bunkers, using grenades and flamethrowers to clear them out. The screams of those inside will haunt me for the rest of my life. Our position was next, and I knew it was only a matter of time before we were overrun. Desperation took hold, and I found myself praying, to what or whom, I don't know. I just prayed for it to end. When the order to retreat finally came, it was both a relief and a death sentence. The beach was a killing field, and crossing it meant exposing ourselves to the same fire we had unleashed on the Americans. But staying meant certain death. I followed the others as we scrambled out of the bunker, dodging bullets and explosions as we made our way inland. The sound of gunfire grew fainter as we ran, replaced by the pounding of my own heartbeat. By the time we reached relative safety, I was too exhausted to feel anything but numbness. Looking back, that morning marked the beginning of the end. The Americans had landed, and they were not going to stop until they had claimed victory. We had underestimated them, their resolve, and their sheer will to fight. In those first few hours on the beaches of Normandy, it became clear that we were fighting a losing battle. The realization was as crushing as any bombardment, and it stayed with me long after the echoes of the guns had faded. The assault on the beach had only just begun, and the chaos seemed to multiply by the second. The Americans, relentless in their approach, surged forward despite the storm of bullets and shells raining down on them. Their landing craft continued to churn through the waves, delivering more soldiers into the inferno. The sheer numbers were staggering. Every time we thought we had repelled a wave, another would arrive, more determined and better coordinated than the last. The beach was littered with bodies, the sand stained red, yet it seemed nothing could deter them. Their resolve was unshakable, and it was beginning to unsettle even the most hardened among us. From my position in the bunker, I could see everything: the Americans struggling to find cover, some using the debris of their fallen comrades as shields, others clawing their way forward in the open, seemingly indifferent to the machine gun fire that tore through the air. Our gunners were relentless, their weapons overheating from the constant firing, but it was like trying to hold back a tidal wave with a net. The Americans moved with a grim efficiency, taking advantage of every lull, every blind spot in our defenses. They had no hesitation, no fear, only a single-minded determination to reach us. I'll never forget the sound of their voices, shouting commands and encouragement to each other over the cacophony of battle. It was in stark contrast to the silence within our ranks. We had been taught to believe in the strength of our position, in the impenetrability of the Atlantic Wall, but as the minutes dragged on, that belief began to erode. Our commanding officer's orders came through the crackling radio, but they were growing more desperate, more frantic. "Hold the line," he said. "Do not let them breach the bunkers." Yet, even he must have known it was a losing battle. One of the landing craft managed to reach the shallows unscathed, and the soldiers poured out like an unstoppable flood. I watched as they advanced, their movements coordinated and precise. They were targeting our machine gun nests, using grenades and suppressive fire to neutralize them one by one. I saw a group of them surround a bunker to our left, their flamethrower operators moving in. Moments later, thick black smoke billowed out, and the screams of the men inside were drowned out by the roar of fire. It was a tactic they repeated again and again, methodical and merciless. For every nest we had, they had a strategy to take it out. Our defenses were crumbling. Ammunition was running low, and the relentless bombardment from the naval ships ensured that resupply was impossible. Every attempt to counterattack was met with devastating force. The Americans had air superiority, and their bombers swooped in with terrifying precision, targeting our reinforcements before they could even reach the front lines. The few vehicles we had were destroyed within moments of being deployed. The battlefield was a charnel house, a grim testament to the ferocity of their assault and the futility of our resistance. In the midst of the chaos, I caught sight of one of their medics, a young man who couldn't have been much older than me. He was running across the open sand, dodging bullets and explosions to reach a wounded comrade. I watched as he pulled the man to safety, even as another explosion threw him to the ground. Somehow, he got back up, carrying the injured soldier to cover. It was a moment of humanity amidst the carnage, and it struck me deeply. These men were not just warriors. They were something else entirely. They were fighting for each other, for something greater than themselves. And that made them unstoppable. By now, the first lines of our bunkers had been breached. The Americans were pushing inland, and the gaps in our defenses were growing wider. Our commanding officer tried to rally us, shouting over the din of battle that we could still hold the second line, that reinforcements were on the way. But we all knew the truth. The second line was already under attack, and the reinforcements were either pinned down or destroyed before they could even reach us. There was no holding the line. There was only survival. I remember the moment the bunker I was in came under direct assault. The walls shook violently as grenades exploded outside, and the air was filled with dust and debris. One of my comrades, a veteran of countless battles, was trying to reload his weapon when a piece of shrapnel tore through his chest. He slumped to the ground without a sound, and I froze, staring at him as the reality of our situation hit me like a freight train. This was it. This was the end. The Americans breached the door, their rifles raised, and for a moment, time seemed to stand still. I expected them to shoot, to end it right there, but instead, they shouted for us to surrender. Their voices were firm but not cruel, commanding but not vengeful. I don't know what compelled me to lower my weapon, but I did. Perhaps it was exhaustion, or perhaps it was the realization that there was no point in fighting anymore. Others followed suit, dropping their guns and raising their hands. The Americans moved quickly, disarming us and securing the bunker. They didn't gloat or mock us. They simply did their job with the same grim efficiency they had shown throughout the battle. As I was led out of the bunker, the full scale of the devastation became clear. The beach was unrecognizable, a hellish landscape of craters, wreckage, and bodies. Smoke hung thick in the air, and the ground was slick with blood. Yet, amidst the destruction, the Americans were already moving forward, securing their foothold and preparing for the next phase of the invasion. They worked tirelessly, their resolve unshaken, their focus unwavering. They had achieved what we had believed to be impossible, and they had done it with a determination that I could not help but respect. That day, I learned something about the nature of war. It is not just about weapons or tactics. It is about the will to fight, the strength to endure, and the belief in something worth fighting for. The Americans had all of that and more. As I watched them push inland, I realized that we had underestimated them, not just as soldiers but as people. They were fighting for freedom, for each other, for a future they believed in. And that made all the difference. The battle had reached its most critical point. The Americans had pushed far beyond the beachhead, and the remnants of our defenses were now scattered across the countryside. The second line, which we had been told was impenetrable, had fallen within hours. By this time, the stark realization of defeat loomed heavy in the air. We were no longer holding a position, we were merely delaying the inevitable. Yet orders kept coming. Hold your ground. Counterattack. Do not retreat. Each command felt more detached from reality than the last, as though our superiors couldn't comprehend what was unfolding on the ground. Our unit had regrouped in the remnants of a farmhouse a few kilometers inland. The structure provided little real cover, its walls riddled with holes from earlier shelling, but it was all we had. Through the broken windows, I could see the fields stretching out into the horizon, dotted with craters and burning vehicles. The Americans were advancing steadily, their forces bolstered by tanks and artillery. Every time they moved, it felt like watching an unstoppable tide, creeping closer and closer with every passing minute. Our commanding officer, Captain Hartmann, stood in the middle of the room, his uniform dusty and torn but his posture rigid. He was shouting orders, trying to organize what little resistance we could muster. "We will hold this position. Reinforcements are coming. They'll link up with us and push them back." The words rang hollow. We all knew reinforcements weren't coming. Those that hadn't been destroyed were pinned down elsewhere, fighting their own losing battles. But no one dared contradict him. The only thing more terrifying than the Americans at this point was the fear of being branded a deserter. I was stationed by the window with a rifle that felt heavier with every passing hour. My fingers were blistered, my hands shaking from exhaustion and adrenaline. The farmhouse was eerily quiet for a brief moment, the only sounds the distant rumble of artillery and the crackling of flames from the fields outside. Then the first American tank crested the hill. Its turret swiveled slowly, scanning for targets. Behind it came the infantry, moving with the same grim determination I had seen on the beach. They were like a machine, relentless and methodical. Hartmann ordered the anti-tank team into position, their faces pale as they scrambled to set up their weapon. The first shot rang out, a deafening blast that sent the shell hurtling toward the tank. It struck the turret, sending a plume of smoke and fire into the air. For a brief moment, a cheer went up among the men, a fleeting sense of triumph. But then another tank appeared, and another, followed by even more infantry. The Americans were unfazed, their advance unbroken. The cheer died as quickly as it had risen, replaced by the cold reality of our situation. The next few minutes were a blur of noise and chaos. The tanks opened fire, their shells reducing the farmhouse walls to rubble. Debris rained down around us as the ground shook with each impact. I fired my rifle blindly through the smoke, not even sure if I was hitting anything. The others were doing the same, our resistance desperate and disorganized. Men were shouting, screaming, falling. The air was thick with dust and the acrid smell of gunpowder. It was a scene from hell, and there was no escape. Through the chaos, I caught glimpses of the Americans advancing. They moved like shadows through the smoke, their silhouettes barely visible but undeniably there. I saw one of them toss a grenade through a gap in the wall. I dove to the ground as the explosion ripped through the room, the force of it knocking the wind out of me. When I looked up, half the men around me were either dead or dying. Blood pooled on the floor, mixing with the dirt and debris. I forced myself to my feet, though my legs felt like they might give out at any moment. Hartmann was still standing, though barely. His face was smeared with blood, and his voice was hoarse from shouting. "Hold the line!" he bellowed, though there was no line left to hold. The Americans were inside the farmhouse now, their rifles raised as they cleared the rooms one by one. I heard the crack of gunfire nearby and knew they were getting closer. My grip on my rifle tightened, but my hands were trembling too much to aim properly. I was out of ammunition anyway. All I could do was wait for the inevitable. The end came not with a bang but with a simple command. "Drop your weapons!" The voice was firm but not harsh, spoken in heavily accented German. I turned to see an American soldier standing in the doorway, his rifle trained on me. His uniform was dirty, his face streaked with sweat and soot, but his eyes were calm and steady. For a moment neither of us moved. Then I let the rifle slip from my hands and raised them in surrender. Around me, others were doing the same. The fight was over. The Americans moved quickly, rounding us up and securing the area. They were efficient but not cruel, treating the wounded among us with a surprising amount of care. One of them even offered me water, which I accepted hesitantly. As I drank, I realized just how parched I was, the adrenaline masking the basic needs of my body. The soldier watched me for a moment before moving on, leaving me to sit in silence among the ruins of what had once been our stronghold. In the hours that followed, I had time to reflect on what had happened. The Americans hadn't just won because of their superior numbers or equipment, though those certainly played a part. They had won because they believed in what they were fighting for. Their resolve was unshakable, their unity unwavering. We, on the other hand, had been fighting out of fear, out of obligation. Our spirits had been broken long before the first shot was fired. Watching them now, moving with purpose and determination, I couldn't help but feel a begrudging respect for them. That day marked a turning point, not just in the battle but in the war itself. Normandy had become a symbol, a testament to the strength and resilience of the Allied forces. And for those of us who had been on the other side, it was a stark reminder of the cost of blind obedience, and the futility of fighting for a cause we no longer believed in. As the sun set over the battlefield, casting long shadows across the ruined landscape, I knew that nothing would ever be the same again. The sun was sinking low over the horizon, casting a somber orange glow across the shattered landscape of Normandy. The once vibrant countryside was now a grim tableau of destruction. Fields that had been lush with crops were scorched and cratered, littered with the remnants of war, twisted metal, burned-out vehicles, and the bodies of soldiers from both sides. The air was heavy with smoke and the acrid stench of gunpowder, mingling with the faint, metallic tang of blood. It was over. The Americans had claimed victory, and we, the defeated, were left to grapple with what that meant. We had been rounded up into a makeshift prisoner of war camp on the outskirts of a small village that had been almost completely destroyed. The surviving buildings stood like skeletons, their walls blackened and their roofs caved in. I sat on the ground among dozens of other German soldiers, my back pressed against the remains of a stone wall. My body ached from exhaustion and minor wounds, but it was the weight in my chest that hurt the most. The realization of defeat had settled deep in my bones, a gnawing emptiness that I couldn't shake. Around me, the others were silent. Some stared blankly at the ground, their expressions vacant, while others buried their faces in their hands, shoulders shaking with quiet sobs. The bravado, the arrogance that had been drilled into us by our superiors, was gone. Stripped of our weapons, our uniforms torn and dirted, we were no longer soldiers of the Reich. We were simply men, broken and defeated. I thought of the propaganda we had been fed, the promises of glory and invincibility. How hollow those promises seemed now. The American soldiers patrolling the camp were a stark contrast to us. They moved with purpose and efficiency, their faces set in expressions of determination. Yet, there was no malice in their eyes as they looked at us. If anything, there was a sense of pity, as though they understood the futility of it all. One of them, a young man with a boyish face and kind eyes, stopped in front of me and offered a canteen of water. I hesitated for a moment before accepting it, muttering a quiet, "Danke." He nodded and moved on without a word. That small act of kindness, so simple yet unexpected, lingered in my mind as the hours dragged on. It was a stark reminder of the humanity that still existed amid the horrors of war. These men, our enemies, had fought with a conviction that we lacked. They believed in something greater than themselves, and it had carried them through the carnage. I wondered what it must feel like to fight for such a cause, to know that your sacrifices were not in vain. As night fell, the camp grew quiet except for the occasional murmur of conversation or the distant rumble of artillery further inland. The Americans were still advancing, pushing deeper into France, their momentum unstoppable. I lay on the cold ground, staring up at the starless sky, and thought about home. I thought about my family, about the village where I had grown up. Were they safe? Did they even know if I was alive? The thought was a bitter one. I had left home full of pride, eager to serve, believing I was part of something great. Now, all I felt was shame. Sleep was elusive. The images of the day played over and over in my mind, the relentless advance of the Americans, the deafening roar of their tanks, the screams of my comrades as the farmhouse we had defended was reduced to rubble. I couldn't stop seeing the faces of the dead, their eyes wide with shock, their bodies twisted unnaturally. I wondered if the Americans carried those same images with them, if they too would be haunted by what they had seen and done. War spares no one, not even the victors. When morning came, the Americans began organizing us for transport. They spoke little, their commands delivered firmly but without cruelty. We were herded into trucks, packed tightly together as the vehicles rumbled down the pitted roads. Through the small openings in the canvas covers, I caught glimpses of the countryside. The destruction stretched as far as the eye could see. Villages reduced to rubble, fields scarred by shelling, forests stripped bare. It was hard to imagine that this had once been a place of beauty and peace. At one point, the truck passed a group of French civilians standing by the roadside. Their faces were a mixture of emotions, relief, anger, sorrow. Some glared at us with open hatred, their fists clenched and their eyes burning with fury. Others simply looked tired, their expressions hollow from years of suffering. A young boy threw a rock at the truck, shouting something I couldn't make out. The rock struck the side of the vehicle with a dull thud, and the boy's mother quickly pulled him back, her face a mask of fear and exhaustion. I couldn't blame them for their anger. We had brought this upon them, upon ourselves. Eventually, we arrived at a larger camp, one that had been hastily constructed to house the growing number of prisoners. The conditions were harsh but not brutal. We were given food and water, enough to sustain us but little more. The guards maintained their watch, always alert, but they did not mistreat us. There was an efficiency to everything they did, a sense of order that felt almost alien after the chaos of the battlefield. Days turned into weeks, and the reality of captivity set in. The war continued to rage beyond the camp's fences, but for us, it was over. There was nothing to do but wait and reflect. I spent hours each day replaying the events that had led us here, questioning everything I had been taught, everything I had believed. The Americans had shown us mercy, treating us not as monsters but as men. It was a mercy we hadn't extended to others, and that realization weighed heavily on me. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, I found myself talking to one of the American guards. He was older, his face lined with age and experience. His German was broken but understandable, and we spoke of many things: home, family, the futility of war. He told me he had a son my age, that he hoped this war would be the last. I nodded, unable to find the words to express the storm of emotions his words stirred within me. In that moment, I realized something profound. We were not so different, he and I. We were both men caught in the machinery of war, both longing for a world where such conflicts no longer existed. As the last light faded from the sky, I felt a small spark of hope, fragile, but real. Perhaps, when all this was over, we could build something better. Perhaps, even amidst the ashes of defeat, there could be a new beginning. The days in captivity stretched into weeks, and the weight of what had happened began to settle in my mind like a heavy fog. I spent most of my time replaying the events that led us to this moment, the choices that had been made, the propaganda we had believed, and the orders we had followed without question. There was no denying the truth anymore. We had been on the wrong side of history, fighting for a cause that had left only devastation in its wake. In the camp, life took on a strange rhythm. The Americans were efficient in their management, treating us humanely but maintaining strict discipline. There was no cruelty, no unnecessary force, only the quiet authority of victors who seemed eager to move forward rather than dwell on vengeance. They fed us, tended to the wounded, and kept order among the prisoners. For many of us, this treatment was unexpected and unsettling, a stark contrast to the indoctrination we had received about the supposed brutality of our enemies. One evening, as the sky turned a soft orange and the first stars began to appear, I found myself sitting near the edge of the camp's perimeter. Beyond the barbed wire, the land stretched out in rolling fields, scarred but still beautiful in the fading light. For the first time in what felt like forever, I allowed myself to think about the future. What would become of us once the war ended? Would we ever go home, or were we destined to be forgotten remnants of a failed regime? An older prisoner sat down beside me, his face lined with the weight of years and sorrow. He had been a schoolteacher before the war, and though we had rarely spoken, his presence was always calm and measured. "You're young," he said quietly, his voice heavy with emotion. "You have a chance to rebuild, to make something better of this world. Don't waste it on anger or regret." I nodded, unsure of how to respond. His words stayed with me, though, echoing in my mind as I lay awake that night. Perhaps there was a way to atone for what we had done, to honor the memories of those we had lost by ensuring that such a conflict would never happen again. The thought brought a small measure of comfort, a faint glimmer of hope amid the darkness. The war's end came quietly for us. News filtered into the camp in fragments. The Allied forces had broken through on all fronts, the German high command was in disarray, and finally, the surrender had been signed. There were no celebrations, no moments of triumph, only the subdued acknowledgement that it was over. The guards' demeanor shifted subtly, their vigilance no less sharp, but their expressions softened. They, too, seemed relieved to see the end of it. In the days that followed, we were processed and prepared for release. Some of us would return to our homes, if they still stood, while others faced an uncertain future in a world forever changed by the war. As I stepped through the gates of the camp for the last time, a strange mix of emotions welled up inside me. Relief, fear, and a lingering sorrow for all that had been lost. The land beyond the camp was quiet, the scars of battle beginning to fade under the gentle touch of nature. Birds sang in the distance, their melodies a reminder that life continued, indifferent to the chaos we had wrought. For the first time in years, I felt the faint stirrings of peace, a fragile but undeniable sense that perhaps the world could heal, and so could we.